So I guess at a high level, thinking about what we want to do today. So Brendan, at a macro level, the macro goal here is there's these converging exponential technologies that are going to come and they're going to affect us in various ways, and we want to make sure that all of that change that's going to be happening is good change, that it's use stressy, that it's anti-fragile, that it's skin in the gamey, and internalizing externalities, kind of that kind of stuff. And as part of that, this specifically as part of this cross-project co-evolution space that's happening around things like both crypto-economic primitives, decentralized governance, and other things that kind of bubble up from the ecosystem that lots of different projects are working on to try to kind of help people collaborate and co-evolve together. So that's the macro goal. I did two yesterday and the day before. We did some crypto-economic primitive ones, which were in general, which were good, hopefully, and were good experiments. Luke was at the one yesterday, and those ones are also, those are a little bit further along, I'd say, within the space, because Simon's been talking about curation market stuff for a while, and TCRs are applicable to anything, and decentralized governance is now getting a lot of press and things with people like Fred and Vlad and Vitalik. But I think we're just at the beginning of what this could look like. So with that as a background, I think, Luke, do you want to give a little bit of an intro on you? And then Brendan, do you want to give us an intro on who you are?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. I'm Luke. I am working on the Aragon project, doing governance research and R&D in general. We're very much focused on kind of an experimental approach. So the Aragon core tool can be used to create lots of different governance structures, from things like co-ops to representative organizations to pretty much anything you can imagine. And we're trying to make it a modular approach. So if there's innovation in one organization, that can be shared across to many other organizations.
Cool. And then Brendan, do you want to give us a high-level overview on you in governance?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I set up this idea of reflexivity over the summer. I've been consulting in the space for a bit. I still consult with Huawei, big Chinese multinational, more on the enterprise blockchain side, obviously, than the public permissionless side. And governance was something just kept coming up. I think when I first looked at how I could help out in the space, I just thought, well, this is the biggest problem right there, right? Because I guess I came at it, I discovered Ethereum a couple of years ago, but when I started looking for problems to help solve and to get involved in, yeah, I guess over the summer you had all the Bitcoin and 2x wars going on, and it just felt that so many projects were trying to solve governance independently. Each network, each DApp, everywhere I went, somebody had a roadmap and governance was on the roadmap. And I was trying to figure out, well, okay, is there something we can do to bring that together? And it's really like in the context of what you said, it's in the context of this anti-fragile thing we're trying to build, is just making sure that we don't mess it up, that the structures are put in place early enough that when the attacks come, and they will come, that we're better prepared to take them on. I do see, I think we can start to see the start of a kind of pure war against some of this. And I think there's a lot of vested interests that will try and stop this movement from happening, and I just want to make sure that the infrastructure is put in place to make sure that it can be protected when that happens. So like most of the things I'm blogging about and writing about is just me trying to get my head around the space at this stage. I have some ideas of how this could be solved, but I haven't been willing to kind of put them out there just yet. I'd rather make sure I learn as much as I can before I kind of put out ideas, but I guess this is the start of that discussion, right? To kind of figure out, right, maybe together we can start to discuss these things.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, just good to get a little bit of an intro there. So I guess what I'd love to do now is share with you guys. I'll share it in the the Gitter channel, there's both a Google Doc, which is just where I'm going to take some notes, but also the Trello link. And so what we do with these is we try to do this thing called a lean coffee, where we essentially, on that Trello link, there's a thing that says circle number 1, and we're essentially just going to put, we're going to take a couple minutes, maybe 3 minutes, to just put top things that we want to talk about onto that list, and then the 3 of us will vote and determine which ones get to the top of that list, and then we'll actually talk about them. It's spending like 4 to 6 minutes on each. Does that kind of make sense?
Sure.
Okay, so let's do it. Let's take maybe like 4-ish minutes to 3 or 4 minutes to write down some things into circle 1 right there. And what so instead of saying governance is, you can put it
as on the list as opposed to
exactly. You
how
should.
do I get rid of this list?
Top left, top right button. I'm just going to archive that for you.
Thank you.
And I'll put it over here.
So where am I supposed to put stuff?
Into the circle number 1 thing. So
okay, and actually there's a lot of stuff already on there, which is great.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Luke, you're writing down all my ones. Like you're writing too fast.
I feel like this is a good start.
Let's take maybe 30 more seconds. I'm adding the power up that allows us to vote. Beautiful. Cool. Let me see. Are there things in my mind? Oh. Okay, sweet. So yeah, let's take maybe, there are currently, 12-ish cards here. Logistics has pretty much already been done. So let's do like, let's have each of us maybe have like maybe 6 votes, 5 or 6 votes that you can put on the cards. So just things that you want to talk about, you can vote on them, and we'll prioritize them.
Okay, how do I vote?
Sorry, with the V button. Hover over a card and then press V, and it allows you to vote. Who gets to vote? Great question.
Yeah, these. I'm putting these in the place.
I'm gonna try out this thing where I share my screen, so that people can see the board. Why not? And also you can see the meta stuff as it repeats on itself. Okay, sweet. OnChain. Cool. So let's chat about some of these things. I think so there's a couple 1 voters and then a couple 3 voters that we all want to talk about. So let's start with this first one from you, Luke, around governance as change management. So I'll set like a 4 or 5 minute timer here, and then we'll start by talking about governance as change management. We'll talk about it for those 4 or 5 minutes, and then we will stop and then determine how much longer we'd like to chat about it. So Luke, take it away.
Sure. So I put this on here because I think the real value in governance and like effective governance in general is to provide assurances around change management or how things change over time. Especially in the blockchain space, we talk about kind of this balance between the immutability of the ledger versus being able to adapt to changes over time, upgradable smart contracts, upgradable protocols. If we were still running on the very first release of the Bitcoin protocol, we probably wouldn't be as successful as we are. So some sort of governance mechanism is needed to give everybody that's participating in in a process, some level of expectations about how it's going to continue to function or change in function over time.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it is, when I kind of bucket that into my mind, was thinking about, sometimes I think about like a slow coin, that is a coin that can be used to incentivize people to build less quickly. This is like not likely to be used today, but maybe in like 30 years if things are way too fast or something. And that makes me think of what you're talking about here, where it's like, hey, we're essentially defining the rules upon which things change, both how quickly it changes, how slow it changes, and like the process by which it changes. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you read much on like change management theory?
I'm not sure about change management theory specifically. I think I'm not trying to point to a specific theory here so much as just a kind of a view on when we're trying to look at how governance processes should be, whether it's better to be informal or formal. The ultimate goal is in managing changes to a system, and kind of managing expectations, having everybody involved in that process. But the ultimate goal is change. If you've got a static system, you don't need governance, period. As soon as you have something that needs to change, or that you have an expectation that change is necessary, you need a governance process.
Yeah, one of the things I put on the list there was FCAPS, right? So my background is I was the founder of and CTO of a telecom security company. So we built, massive scale infrastructure for securing telecoms networks. And in the telecoms industry, there's this concept of FCAPS, which is so it stands for so there's fault management, configuration management. It's usually accounting, performance, and security, and they're the kind of they're the functions of a management network in the telecoms industry, and it seems to be very closely related to what we're talking about here. It's everything to do with what version of the software you're running, how that software is configured, how do you push changes to that configuration, and how do you respond when the software is not behaving as you expect, right? So if there's in the blockchain case, it could be a denial of service, or it could just be a bug. It could be somebody's pushed some changes that just was causing some instability, and it's about how do you react to that. And in the telco world, you separate out the concerns. You have a management network, and you have it separate from your traffic plane. And I think those ideas are actually very relevant to what we're trying to do here.
More on that, the management network being different than the traffic plane?
Yeah, it's one of these things that in the context of what I'm talking about with FCAPS, like when there's a problem with your traffic plane, what you don't want to have is your management, the packets for your, where you the interface where you're managing it running over the same network as your traffic plane, because if there's a denial of service attack, you may not have, you basically, you don't have access to management layer, because you just can't get your packets through. So there's always there's separate physical layers in a telecoms network where you separate out the different planes. And I think that is going to be more important over time here, right? That you want to make sure that you never, when the network's under attack, that you still have control over it, right? And it's the very point in time when the network is under attack that you most need a kind of speedy governance response, right? And I'm thinking kind of like a few years ahead, like beyond the time where we're responding to, say, a DAO attack or whatever. Like I'm moving beyond that to where you have a small group of people to actually where those small group of people have actually handed over governance, and the only way to control the network is through this decentralized governance model. You need to make sure that it works as you expect, when that happens. And I'm not sure that's something that people are quite are talking about right now in terms of how you build this for a future, right? How do you future-proof this? Does that make sense?
I think it does. Let me pause you for a second. So now we vote on the right-hand side how many, let me make sure that it doesn't do the meta thing. And then we vote on the right-hand side how many more minutes we'd like to talk about this topic. So you can put any number between like 1 and 4 into the chat message window on the right-hand side of the Google thing, exactly. You see that, Brendan? So go to your Google Hangouts thing, and then on the right side, or actually, yeah, boom, perfect. Okay, so let's chat for 3 or 4 more minutes. So the thing that's on my mind with respect to this stuff is, I definitely agree that thinking from that layer perspective allows there to be, who governs the governance layer is kind of one question that comes to my mind there. The other thing I think about here is that FCAPS sounds like it is, I just want to make sure that we're thinking about, and this is kind of similar to on-chain, off-chain governments, but there's, FCAPS sounds like the, implementation about how the code itself changes, how like the objects change. And this is kind of to this like weirder side of governance, but I think that there's also, and this goes into like the change management things, this thing called like an immunity to change map. There's also like how like us as humans change within these systems as well. And I don't know if that should be bucketed within governance, but that I think is, if we want to, that would be the human non-technical side of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to continue talking about this is because something that Brendan said specifically jumped out at me in the FCAP conversation.
Yep.
There was the notion of you need control. You need to be able to respond in the event that there's a fault. And I think it's particularly challenging in the decentralized context how you define you, because in the context of like a telecom provider, that might be a very small group of people that are doing the responsiveness. In a decentralized context, you're trying to balance like reacting among a very large group of people simultaneously. And I think that notion of kind of who is making the changes and under what situations can they make changes is kind of the root of what we're trying to get at. And you can break that into many different functional layers. Like you can say on-chain versus off-chain. You can say formal processes versus informal processes, where people are basically at the end of the day, there's always an informal process, which is users decide which tool they're using, where they store their value or give their attention. I mean, no matter what governance system you design, that's always going to be the case, especially in kind of the context of a blockchain network where everything's open source and forkable. But I think defining the people that we want to give the authority to make changes and why we give those specific people that power, I think is a critical conversation.
Yeah, I think FCAPS only comes in at the end of that. Like you say, you have to pick the people first, but it's the people. FCAPS will tell you when to hand the control over to those people. You know, if there's an urgent issue, then you know that, you know, as quickly as possible, as quickly as you can get a vote together, you have a vote, and then the outcome of that vote is to hand over to this small group. It's like, right, now go save the network, right? You are now authorized to save the network from this attack or from this bug or this.
Is the concern about rapid response then, in the sense that we need some process in place so that we can respond quickly, and because we need to respond quickly, we can't necessarily rely on some other layers of consensus, like the off-chain coordination. We need to act more quickly than that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I think I guess the main point is the on-chain versus the off-chain versus on-chain is the wrong distinction, right? There has to be processes and checks and balances and different ways to escalate, and there's going to be a complex hierarchy of which situations you can have everybody vote on, or which situations you have a subset vote on, and where you would want to have kind of pre-agreed response teams that are pre-authorized to do certain things, you know, because the community knows who they are and trusts them, right? But they probably still need to get authority for most things. Maybe there's an urgent class where it's just automatically assumed, right? The software automatically, or the management layer or the governance layer automatically knows there's a big threat and just automatically gets that, okay, if one of these authorized people jump on the system, then they're authorized to do whatever they want because we're in an emergency situation. So it's how do you define when that emergency situation started, and to be prepared for it before it starts.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm thinking about here is in terms of this question of who gets authority, and as we know here that we're talking about like how decisions get made, which is like clearly one of the most complex things. And I agree with you, Brendan, that yeah, it's going to be some kind of complex hierarchy and systems there in terms of all those different buckets that Luke was outlining with on-chain, off-chain, etc. The other thing that comes to my mind here is how people at a root level, I think some of this stuff is like, I'm thinking about like in terms of who gets authority and reputation systems and trust. And I'm thinking about like if you guys have read the book Influence by Robert Cialdini, in terms of how people essentially gain trust, whether it's trust by authority, trust by social signaling, trust by scarcity, stuff like that. I'm also thinking about like some of these like core value pieces here where you can essentially signal to people like how these are all, I guess, ways that I'm thinking about how one determines authority or reputation within these systems. So Luke, do you have any final thoughts on this? And I think we can head on to the next one.
No, I feel like that's actually a good transition.
Sweet, let's do it. So let's discuss. I think that this on-chain, off-chain one can be the top next one here. So yeah, on-chain, off-chain. I guess this was mine. Yeah, the question here, and this is one of the many buckets that exist within governance in terms of how things can be governed. And on-chain, off-chain is one of the big debates that are happening right now in terms of Tezos and Vlad versus Fred and things like that. So what are your guys' initial takes on some of this?
I guess I'll go first. I think on-chain processes have the disadvantage that they have to be formal. They have to be well-defined, well understood, and something that you can actually program into a system. So you need to be able to define all of your groups, define how they're granted authority, under what conditions they can use that. You have to have all of that information set up and programmed from day one, which can be challenging, right? These are complex processes. It's difficult from the get-go to see exactly how all of those moving pieces are going to interact eventually and balance that. So the advantage of choosing not to move something to an on-chain process is that it can sort of evolve more informally. It can kind of have emergent structure, which is sort of what we see in kind of the Ethereum governance process now. It's not super well documented exactly how everything works. Most people don't even know exactly how the roadmap is managed, but there is some sort of consistent process, and if you peel back the layers, you can sort of find it. But I think eventually more and more governance has to move on-chain because on-chain processes are transparent. Everybody who is participating knows up front, has certain degree or guarantees about how the process works, how things can change or will change, and can reason about that much more effectively than sort of an off-chain process that is tribal knowledge.
Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I guess it goes back to what I said before. Yeah, it's just not, it can't be on-chain or off-chain. It has to be some combination of both, right? They're both suitable for different things. You know, one of the things I put on the list there was treasury as well, right? Because I kind of have it. I'm building up as I try to think about governance. I think of governance as FCAPS, as in, you know, configuration management, or governance as, you know, the treasury management comes up a lot as well, right? And
see what you mean by that? Actually, I don't know what you mean by treasury management.
Well, treasury in the sense that there's a certain, for most networks, there's some amount of financial decision making that has to be made. Now, for some networks, that is, you know, they take a cut of the mining fees and they put it in a treasury, like in Dash. Dash is probably the best example. And then they use that pool of money then to invest in the community and in projects. and there's a mechanism then to vote on how that money is spent. But I think there's going to be more and more, like I think in Melonport's case, they've a plan for some of the fees, like the fees that get charged on the network, to be decided by some governance mechanism as well, right? So you can see any kind of fees, like whether it's transaction fees, mining fees, even token issuance, I think is going to come up, right? There's going to be rules, like I think Melonport did it as well, where they've made decisions around. Initially, they've kind of said that they were going to issue more tokens, but then they realized actually the money they raised in the first round was enough, and that they didn't need to do another token sale. And there's decisions then of like, well, actually, do we need to issue more tokens? We were actually the project's well funded. And I think the token issuance thing creates uncertainty for investors, right? Investors need to know, what they're buying, right? If they're buying, 1,000 tokens with a network with 21 million tokens, then they need to know that that's not going to change tomorrow, right? Or if it does change tomorrow, they need to know the mechanism by which it will change. So therefore, they can somehow measure the risk of, like, how likely is it that this currency will be inflated, or like is the risks I need to be aware of when I'm making the purchase decision. So I don't know if they all fit in with that treasury model, but they're all kind of financial themed governance decisions. That some of them make sense on chain, some of them will be off chain, and I need to figure out like how would that break down? Like what's the right breakdown in terms of how you make those decisions?
Yep. Cool. So let's do a little bit of voting on the side here. How much longer do you want to talk about on-chain versus off-chain voting? Two. Correct answer, Brendan. We had already voted two. My thoughts on this is, the only thing on top of my mind is, I think, Luke, you presented kind of a on-chain versus off-chain, and like the desire over time to make the on-chain govern, or to move things more towards on-chain because it's transparent and the processes are clear or whatever, versus like the more tribal knowledge version. I think that there's an argument there. I would say there's another argument that can be made, that is, take the more tribal knowledge version, or the version that's more kind of complex, human, organic, and processize it more. And what I mean by that is like the ability to take the tribal knowledge and say, no, okay, here is a TCR of all the information that is being looked at in order to make this governance decision, or here is and people are kind of, I guess, like, it's not necessarily all being on chain, but there to be like off-chain processes that allow, or like, let's say all governance decisions must be made over Google Hangouts, on a transparent Google Hangout like this one or whatever. I think that there are ways to make the off-chain stuff be more like on-chainy without necessarily making it on-chain.
I think that's definitely true. I think the reason that I think there's a pressure to move more and more things on chain is, and I think Brendan sort of alluded to this in the idea of the treasury and investors' perspective, where you've got these tokens that people are trading and buying and looking at, even if they're not securities, as something that they're considering a store of value, or they're putting financial interest into to some degree. And in order to protect that financial interest that's actually quantifiable, the systems that give more voice to those users are going to tend to have a greater or more compelling story from that investor perspective. And then you could also make the argument that if you have a greater, more compelling story from the investor perspective, you're probably going to have a much larger network effect. Most of the network effects in crypto right now being driven by speculative investors, more so than anything else. So from that perspective, I don't know if it's like a good or bad sort of judgment, more it seems likely that the demand from people that are using these networks are going to push towards more formal, more on-chain processes over time.
What are your guys' thoughts in terms of like, from like a next step perspective, in terms of on-chain versus off-chain governance? How will we hopefully provide more texture on the pros and cons to this debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about keeping the human side is important, right? When you're doing these votes, because we know a lot, right? And I guess that's what some of the stuff I've been blogging about. We know a lot about what goes wrong with governance, right? Because we're in the middle of a various messes across the globe. Yeah, and I think that the best way to keep that kind of humanity as we go to on-chain voting is to try and figure out like what voting system is going to make people feel that, you know, they're part of the process. So it needs to be transparent, but and it needs, people need to feel that it's valid, right? Whatever the process is, that it's valid and they're part of it, and that they can engage in it in a meaningful way, and that it, you know, it can't be corrupted. And I'm not sure we're heading in the right way. Like, I've kind of avoided saying it directly in any of the blog posts, but my concern right now is a lot of the voting that's coming up is voting by stake, right? It's voting in proportion to your stake in the network, right? Which is fine when the founders of a network, you know, own most of the tokens. But when I look forward 5-10 years, you know, it's fairly obvious to me that most of these networks will be like, once the network effects grow and corporates buy into this as a future of business, they will want to have big stakes in this. And the idea that, you know, the votes are in proportional to your stake is a very dangerous idea for me, right? And goes and it cuts to the heart of what we're talking about when we say, like, how do we make sure this is human? How do we make sure that these infrastructures are there for the community? They're governed, you know, by and on behalf of the community, and not subject to be taken over. So I think we need to have a big discussion about how we do this. Now, I understand that the issue is when you have these kind of, when you're trying to build pseudonymity into the network, then you obviously, you can't have a strong identity, and therefore you don't have this concept of one person, one vote. So you need to come up with some other mechanisms, and I think that's what we need to get to the bottom of, is like what's out there in terms of academia. You know, what kind of research has been done in terms of how do you make sure that you stop these voting mechanisms from being taken over, like, and evolving into some kind of plutocracy.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see that as worrying, particularly in the context of blockchains that are forkable. People seem to have this idea that network effects are very, very, like, they have this strong foothold because you have a strong network effect. But if everything that you're building can be instantly replaced, the balances can be changed for people that are kind of voting against it, and you can basically isolate. Like, if you've got a divisive vote by stake, or you have a community that's not represented, they can exit and create their own network. And as more and more of the, like, things that we rely on in terms of infrastructure are moved into these decentralized processes that can easily be forked, as opposed to these centralized institutions that rely on like assets that can't be split in half or duplicated, you have an inherent check on the ability of like plutarchy to actually cause harm for the people that are using the network.
Yeah, yes and no. I think that the thing is, mostly when we're talking about these discussions, you know, where we're, you know, whether it's Vlad or Fred or whatever getting involved in discussions, we tend to think of it in terms of Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? And I would argue both of those, they're probably, of the networks that I think are most interesting, I actually think they're the two with the weakest network effects. Ethereum, because the virtual machine is portable across networks, right? So you're going to have smart contracts on lots of platforms, and therefore Ethereum doesn't have that network effect, because it's the network effect is around the developer tools, and the developer, the number of developers who can code Solidity and deliver robust dApps is what the network effect is, and that network is portable across networks. So it's the EVM has a network effect, not Ethereum. And I think the same thing for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin has got fairly weak network effects, right? Right now, it's a store of value, and the store of value is the only network I care about when something's a store of value is the network of people who can cash in my Bitcoin. And that tends to be fairly small, right? It doesn't matter to me if there's 1 billion Bitcoin owners. What matters to me is, in an emergency and I need to get my value, who's going to give it to me in cold hard currency, and something that can, that I can buy food with, right? And so I think that has a weaker network effect. Like the counter example I would say would be something like a decentralized exchange, right? Where a decentralized, like having 50 decentralized exchanges doesn't help anybody, right? Where liquidity pools is the most important thing for a decentralized exchange, and whichever decentralized exchange gets that pool of the volume in terms of trading, they have that network effect, and you can't just say we're going to fork the code and go off here, right? Because if the liquidity doesn't come with you, then I think it's very hard. It would be very risky for someone to then go and do that. I think Melonport's another good example where you have, if Melonport succeed and they get fund managers, that have huge followings, and everybody wants to compete against the best fund managers, then there's a massive network effect there, right? So I think each network has to be kind of judged on its own basis of like, is there a meaningful network effect? And if there is, that's going to make it really, really hard to fork, right? So the exit rights are severely diminished.
I think that's absolutely true. But like for the decentralized exchange example, if you've got governance, like stake-based governance over this decentralized exchange, and they've got this huge, massive network effect, and nobody wants to use another exchange because everybody's already on this one, there's a much greater limit to the amount of rent that exchange can seek based on that network effect, because it's very, very easy for you to take all of the infrastructure, all of the code, and open up a new exchange that doesn't charge any fees, period, or excessive fees. And then instead of it being you don't have the network effect and you don't have the liquidity, but you have an objectively better product. And so pulling that network effect slowly over to the new one is much easier than, say, if you were a completely new entrant to the market and you've got large upfront capital costs for startup. It's a much more level playing field, and those network effects, even if they exist in terms of developer tools or in terms of like liquidity, are just much less defensible than what we see in kind of traditional centralized.
For sure. Yeah, no, I agree. It's definitely less defensible. All right. And sorry, we went over the 2 minutes.
It's okay. Yeah, I think that was a good discussion. I think
I got a bit carried away.
the key is that the concept of exit invoice is crucial. The network effects are crucial. What those network effects are composed of in these new blockchain-based worlds is crucial. And then determining as how part of a key part of governance is exit invoice. So always putting into that bucket is good. So let's go to the discussion on the recent articles. And I guess, we can just chat about which one. We can either chat about either the articles that you guys wrote recently, or we could talk about the Fred Esrom versus Vlad versus Vitalik piece. What are you guys, which ones came to the top of your mind when you were thinking about this stuff?
I'll let you go first, Luke.
I don't have a really strong preference where we start. We could kind of go sequentially. The Fred Esrom piece sort of kicked off quite a bit of discussion and debate around that. I feel like the most important point that he was making was that we're going to see like a Cambrian explosion of these governance processes, especially on-chain processes, because that's what is going to be done in code. And if you're doing something in code and you've got a way to kind of test it out and experiment and basically A/B test these things, you're going to see a lot more variance. You're going to see a lot more rapid evolution than what you kind of see or what we have seen historically in the space. And that point, I think, is what I really got out of that article. I didn't actually take that in the way that I think Vlad was responding to, that like we need to immediately change Ethereum governance to some specific on-chain model, but rather we should anticipate and expect that there's going to be a lot of innovation, a lot of change in governance processes, and we're going to be able to collect a lot more data. So existing processes need to be like aware of that, and they need to be more willing and adaptable if something appears to be working successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the top thing to take away from that article is this Cambrian explosion of governance processes. And that's why I think, when I think about this ETH Commons work that I'm doing, it's like, okay, some of the things that pop up, like Simon De La Riviere is like, hey, I would expect to see 1,000 TCRs by the end of next year, and they're essentially 0 right now. And similar with governance things, where it's like, if we expect to see, hundreds of different governance processes happening, and we clearly have lots of governance happening now as well, but I think that, yeah, this Cambrian explosion, we're just at the beginning of seeing it as things like 0x and a lot of other networks start to push deeper into the space, and as we have more and more people come into the ecosystem from a speculative perspective and then get into the projects themselves, yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of explosion here. And who thinks about, and how do we determine the learnings and the cross applying the learnings and stuff like that? Like an A/B test that's done by Facebook is easy because they do it and then they choose, okay, this one worked and this one didn't work. And in decentralized governance systems, those kind of changes will percolate through the system in a slower way, likely.
Yeah, I don't know. This kind of scares me a bit. I don't know. I'm uncomfortable about this idea of a Cambrian explosion, like a Cambrian explosion of networks. Yes. The same scale of experimentation with governance. Yeah, I worry how much time this whole experiment, this whole kind of crypto experiment has to play out, right? And this is where I kind of came to governance. Like I said, when I started in the summer, it was already looking at a kind of overheated token market going, shit, this could blow up and this could be very damaging. And now 6 months later, it's like way more overheated than I could possibly have imagined 6 months ago. So it does worry me that I'm not overly sure we have that much time. Okay, we have time in the sense that, right, it's software and it's code and it'll happen, right? And it could happen over decades. What I mean by that is, like, there's so much momentum right now that it would be such a shame to lose it, and to lose it because we didn't get the governance right. And the thoughts of there being tens of experiments, great. Like hundreds or thousands of experiments fills me full of dread. And it goes back, I think, to the point Nick Szabo made, where he tweeted to say that he didn't think people should be trying to design new governance models because we already have a perfectly functioning governance model, which is the open source governance model, and that's fine, and it works, and it's proven, and we should just use it and stop talking about governance. At least that was my interpretation of what he said. And yeah, that worries me as well. It's like I think we need to think long and hard about it. I would rather there be a focus on thinking about the right designs for governance and running with a smaller number of experiments than trying to have a large number of experiments.
I think
So,
I think we should move on to the next one. But I think that the question there is, can you just think about the governance without actually implementing it in the real world with real skin in the game and things like that? And maybe the best way to test these systems is by actually doing them in the real world. So with that, let's spend maybe 3 more minutes on this stuff, and then we'll go into retro mode. Do you guys have thoughts on either Vlad's piece or Vitalik's piece?
I had a thought on, I guess Vitalik and Vlad, a lot of what they were saying is very similar, which I mean, makes sense. I'm sure they've discussed this a lot. But the kind of conclusion to Vitalik's post where he's talking about kind of coin voting as just one of many signals that are inputs to a governance process was really interesting. And the fact that right now in the Ethereum process, we really only do carbon vote in the event that there's a like financial change to like the like issuance or something. That would be something that the EIP for that would probably go through a carbon vote process. Or like the DAO rescue fork that went through carbon vote. And it seems to me like there's an opportunity to actually do that, like make that process more seamless, and every EIP that gets to a certain stage goes through some sort of coin voting process. It's not necessarily attached to anything. It's just sort of a signal. I think that could be really useful. The fact that the downside to that I think he brought up was the fact that there's very low participation in like any of these carbon vote things. And I think that is a good reason for it to be like one of many signals. Is if we're not sure that like it's actually representative of the community because there's a very small fraction of people participating, how value is that as a signal? It is certainly valid. But if we start training the community to get more involved, to exercise their voice, or we start doing things like rather than it being a direct process, implement sort of delegative signaling, like a liquid democracy type thing. On top of that, you can have people that are participating in a much less like active role. So as like a coin holder, I may not feel comfortable voicing my opinion on a specific EIP, but I could delegate to somebody in the community who I respect or I trust, or even just a friend that I respect or trust. And in that way, we might see much greater participation in those processes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, yeah, I actually went through after Vlad's post. I went through the EIP and the Yellow Paper Committee, and I was kind of reading through the whole process there, how that works. I mean, I don't think it's as transparent as Vlad would like to think it is. I mean, it's there and it's documented. There's just no sign that that's actually how it works. You know, like I've worked in so many companies where there's a process that's documented, but it's not necessarily the process that actually runs the show. Now it could be the case. It could be it works exactly as documented, but there's no sense of a trail of how these decisions were made or how votes were taken or minutes of. You know, so you know, we had a meeting and such a vote was taken, and these kind of discussions happen. So I don't know. Maybe it's there, but I don't really get a sense that it's you know, it feels to me as an outsider that it's, you know, that there's a small group, and you know, it's a fairly informal process, right? Which is fine. It obviously works very effectively. The question is just, yeah, how do you take that out, like as this. Like you said earlier, as this scales to kind of trillions of dollars of global networks, then you know, how do you move that?
Yeah, I think
to the next level.
I think that on Luke's point, I feel like actually on that point, I feel like a big question with governance is the governance, like information is a key part of governance. Who knows what information? How does the information get fed to them? And that's one side of this that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much in governance. Is I guess some is like transparency is just really key to governance. And then on the point of signaling, super into signaling, really like it as both a human thing and as a non-human thing, weird things like virtue signaling. And then one of the thoughts that came to the top of my mind was, I think is a good test case for this stuff in general, is how would we want to govern the like parity exploit, which I think we'll pause on for a second. But that was the final thing that just came to the top of my mind. So with that, let us do, well, I guess one thing to check on in terms of from a pure next step perspective, I feel like a lot of the crypto economic primitive stuff is further along in terms of people implementing things, people actively doing testing and experiments with stuff. With this governance, decentralized governance, I feel like we were at a little bit more of kind of like a more abstracted level here. Are there next steps that either of you guys would like to see if we think about, you know, January into February of next year in terms of how we make progress on governance and decentralized governance?
Yeah, I think the first thing is exactly kind of related to what you just said, is how do we pull in the people that are working on this, who are thinking about this, right? I know Reto in Melonport has been working on some stuff. Now he's given me some feedback before. I just know he's very busy. But yeah, if we could even get him on a call or get something lined up. I guess it's just trying to make sure. Yeah, Alex. Alex. I've spoken to Alex about it. He's all over this as well.
You know, all the people.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know there's kind of like a lot of what I've been looking at recently is what Cardano are doing, but I'm not I'm not sure how that works out, because I know there seems to be some tension between the Cardano community and the Ethereum community. So I don't know. Every time I go on Twitter, I feel a bit nervous when that all feels like it's going to kick off. So but certainly Cardano are doing some interesting stuff. So whether we can, it doesn't have to be Charles we bring in, but we could bring in some of the academics they have working on this problem. So I think that's it from my perspective, is just making sure that we have the people that are most immersed in this space on these calls.
Cool. Luke, any thoughts from your mind on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's 2 points I would add. I definitely in support of getting more people that are working on this having public discourse, because people are talking about this, but they're talking about it in channels that aren't particularly public or that people are particularly engaged with most of the time. And I think it's such an important topic. It just needs to be top of mind for more people, and people need to be discussing the pros and cons of various different approaches. And it's been great to see that start to happen. I think Friday Eshrom's post was a great catalyst for that. The other thing I guess I would say is I think a lot of the opportunity for being creative and more experimental is going to happen in much smaller projects, probably with like even just dApp developers, as opposed to like existing protocols like Ethereum that already have huge market caps and a tremendous amount of value at stake. Like we've got a working process for that for now. As long as we continue to kind of talk and discuss it and understand it and be willing to like see what else is there, I think that's fine. But for new projects or people that are doing like writing smart contracts now, that are trying to do like upgradable smart contracts, and they need a governance process for that, there's so much less at stake and people can be so much more agile. I think that's where we're going to get a lot of data points and a lot of experimentation, which can then feed in and inform some of these conversations and these discussions for these larger networks. Yeah, so I think my focus, and I think the focus at Aragon right now is to enable that type of experimentation that will then lead to kind of continuous improvement in the space.
Cool. Does that make sense? I need to run right now, but if possible, I'd love for you guys to, there's this like plus delta thing on the board. And if you can write just a couple pluses and are like, oh, this was good. Or on the delta in terms like, oh, this stuff wasn't good. I'd appreciate it so that we can make the next one even better. And with that, Brennan, it was nice to meet you over the interwebs. Let me unscreen share. And this was fun. Luke, good to see you again. And whoever is listening, we had 3 viewers, which was more than any of the crypto economic primitive stuff. So yeah, our viewers, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Decentralized Governance. Yeah, and
probably Alex, Charles, and Vlad.
Exactly. I bet they're definitely listening. Thank you guys so much, and I gotta get out of here.
All right, cheers.
Bye.
Thanks,
See ya.
Thank you.